Hi everyone, my name's Jen and I'm the co-founder of Mieux. In today's presentation, we're going to be looking at evidence-based solutions to match the scale of the climate crisis. So what does this mean? It means during this presentation, we're going to be covering the most effective things that you can do as an individual to have the biggest impact possible on the climate. We're going to be looking at which lifestyle decisions are the most effective in terms of emissions reduction, and we're also going to be looking at other ways that you can act to have an impact beyond just your own carbon footprint. Before we get stuck in, I'd recommend getting a piece of paper and a pen because there's going to be some interactive questions along the way. And most importantly, at the end of this presentation, I'm going to be asking you to reflect on how you can make a big impact for the climate, but also to pin you down to put some timescales for yourself so that you don't just watch this presentation and walk away and do nothing. This presentation is really about empowering you to act and be as effective as you can and have the most positive impact you can on the climate. And this graph is taken from Our World in Data, which is an incredible website I recommend you all go and look at. And it shows expected global temperature rises by 2100 under different conditions. So as you can see on this graph, if we didn't have any climate policies in place, we could be facing around 4.8 degrees of warming. Whereas if we stick to our current policies, we'd be looking at 2.9 degrees. Now we really want to keep global warming below 2 degrees. And it's clear from this graph that policy is one of the biggest levers we can pull in order to reduce climate change and keep us to that 2-degree level. And we're going to be talking about how you as an individual can influence policy a bit later on in this presentation. But for now, just keep this in mind. Last year, we saw wildfires across the US, we saw flooding in Central and Eastern Europe, and in the UK. Really every country in the world is really feeling the effects of climate change now. So, if people are feeling the effects of climate change, why aren't people acting? Why aren't governments agitating for and encouraging really ambitious climate policies? The lack of action can really make us feel that no one cares about climate change. But what's the reality? Do people care? Now, there's been several global studies over the last few years on people's attitudes towards climate change. And one of the biggest studies took hundreds of thousands of people from in total, from every country in the world, and asked them different questions to see what their attitude was towards climate change. So they asked them different questions like, do you care about climate change? Would you support global policies to address climate change? And would you give 1% of your income to stop climate change? Now, I want you to take your pen and paper, and I want you to think, what do you think respondents answered? Okay, so the first question was, do you care about climate change? And when the researchers asked this question, they clarified by saying, do you care about climate change? And that means that A, you think climate change is real, it's happening. B, you think it's man-made. And C, you think urgent action is needed to address climate change. So think in your head, what percentage of people under these conditions do you think care? And just write it down. Okay, and so the second question they were asked was, would you support global policies to address climate change? And this includes things like carbon taxation, investment in renewable technologies and public transport, and reforestation projects. So what percentage of people do you think said they would vote for policies like this? Okay, and the final question I want you to consider is, what percentage of people do you think would give 1% of their income to stop climate change? Now, of course, there's a big gap between what people say they would do and what they would actually do, but I just want you to consider, what did people say they would do? And write a figure down. Okay, so let's look at the answers then. What percentage of people in this study said they cared about climate change? 86%. What percentage would support global policies to address climate change? 72%. And finally, what percentage of people would give 1% of their income to stop climate change? 69%. Okay, so I imagine that might be a bit higher than you expected. I've done this presentation a few times, and to be honest, most people for the first question think it's around 40%, the second 30%, and the final one between 1 and 10%. Maybe you're more optimistic, but in general, we have a really pessimistic outlook on how much people care about climate change. So this is really, I think, the first big misconception holding us back from making progress on climate change, and this idea that people don't care about climate change. And so what's the reason for this gap between our perception and reality? Well, it's a cognitive bias that many of us have called individual optimism and societal pessimism. And it's this belief that I care about climate change, I'm honourable, I'm willing to do the right thing, but everyone else, they just, honestly, they don't care. No one else cares about it, I do. Now, this sort of bias that we have is prevalent in many things in our lives that we're not even aware about. And probably the classic example of this is if you ask people how good they are at driving, 80% of people say they're above average at driving. Now, obviously, that's not how averages work, but we do tend to go about our daily lives with this conception that we're much better than other people. Now, the problem with this, especially when it comes to climate change, is that this really leads to a sense of hopelessness and lack of ambition, because we're not going to be motivated to make a change if we don't think anyone else will, especially when it comes to a problem as big and as complicated as climate change. Now, even worse than the fact that we hold this misconception, our global leaders hold this misconception too. So they're going to be very unlikely to push forward ambitious policies if they don't think anyone else cares or anyone else will vote for them. The second misconception that we hold is that lack of awareness is the problem. If only more people knew about climate change, then more people would be willing to act and do something. Now, I don't know about you, but my newsfeed is full of terrible news about climate change. So in the UK, we have this newspaper called The Guardian, and they produce a piece of environmental journalism every 3 to 4 hours. And if you look through their very motivating series, The Age of Extinction, you'll find tons of bad news about just how catastrophic climate change is. Now, if you look through those articles, and I looked through the last 30 a couple of months ago, what you'll find is they have plenty of bad news, but no actionable tips that you as an individual can take away in order to have a positive impact on the climate. So what happens then? Our newsfeed is full of bad news about climate change, but we have no actionable tips about things that we can do in order to make a difference. So in this set of circumstances, the logical thing to do is to avoid the news. Don't read it, it's too anxiety provoking and there's just nothing we can do anyway. So this leads to inaction and avoidance. So I would argue it's not awareness of climate change that's the problem, it's awareness of what we can do about it. And the final misconception, imagine even if we get over our feelings of hopelessness and anxiety and avoidance, there's often a big gap between what we believe is effective and what's actually effective for the climate. And this can lead us to put our effort in the wrong place. The second exercise I'd like you to do before we go on is to just take 5 minutes and think about all of the things that you do in your life currently in order to have a positive impact on the climate or reduce your own footprint. And I want you to write down the top 3 things that you're doing and a rough guess of how many tons of emissions you think that you're avoiding through these actions. Don't research on Google, just go for your gut feeling, go for what you think and write them down, and feel free to pause the video until you've came up with your 3 answers. So, that could be anything from, maybe you don't fly as much, or maybe you've changed your diet. So just think of the 3 top things you're currently doing for the climate. Okay, so let's compare now your list with other people. So Hannah Ritchie is a data scientist and she works for Our World in Data. And she did a big survey of people and asked them, what do they think is the most effective thing that they could do for the climate? So what you'll see over here, people gave different answers, such as going car-free, having a plant-based diet. And what you can see is that 59% of people thought that recycling was the most effective thing they could do for the climate, meaning that they believe that recycling reduces the most tons of emission of all those other things on the list. Now, let's have a look at the reality. Let's have a look for each of these actions, how many tons of emissions are actually avoided. Now, what's quite stark here, what you can see, is that although most people thought recycling was the most effective, in fact, recycling is really far down the list. It's only saving 0.2 tonnes of carbon equivalent emissions per year. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't recycle. Of course, there's plenty of other reasons beyond just your carbon footprint to recycle. But the reason it's important to know the difference between your perception and reality is if you believe that recycling is really effective, the most effective thing you can do, and you recycle a lot, then it can lead to this thing called moral licensing, where you say, I do my recycling, that's really good for the climate, therefore I'm okay to take this flight this year, I don't need to bother with the electric car, I'm going to just continue to eat meat 3 times a day. So that's really the problem with having a warped perception of what's effective. So let's look at what actually is effective. You can see top of the list, giving up your SUV. So that's those big trucks that you don't tend to get so much in Europe, but more so in America. So giving that up is one of the most effective things you can do, or going car free or switching to a plant-based diet. Now, one thing I would like to note is on this list, these are how these individual lifestyle choices reduce your own carbon footprint. But there are a few things on here that have a much bigger impact than just on your own individual footprint. And I'll give 2 examples. The first is a plant-based diet. So if you're the first person in your family or your friend group to go plant-based, then you'll very likely influence other people around you to reduce their meat intake. So therefore you have a bigger impact than just the 2 tons of emission reduction per year alone, but also you're influencing the market. Every time you buy something plant-based or you go for the vegetarian option in a restaurant, you bring the price down of those sorts of foods for everyone else and you make it more available. So if a restaurant's always getting orders for vegetarian food, they'll probably increase their selection and then more people are encouraged to make that choice too. And the same goes for switching to an electric car. So if you're an early adopter of technology like solar panels or an electric car, you bring the price down for everyone. You make it so that, the materials are cheaper to manufacture. You make it so there's more electric charging points as more people have a car. So you actually make it easier for more people to have it. And to illustrate the power of individual choices over the market, if you look at electric cars, for example, in the early 1990s, the equivalent Tesla battery that you find in Tesla cars today would have cost nearly $500,000 to produce. And today the production costs for a battery like that are only $16,000. So solar and batteries have gone through a huge transformation, and they're way cheaper today. And this is really thanks to early adopters. And so if you really want to make a big positive impact on the climate, if you really want to reduce your own emissions as much as possible, then a really good thing to consider is, does this action only reduce my own carbon footprint, or is it actually contributing to larger societal change? So quick summary of the 3 misconceptions. Number 1, more people care than we think. Number 2, it's not lack of awareness that's the problem, but it's actually lack of awareness of what's effective. Okay, so what you'll have noticed on the previous slides is even if you were to do all of the really effective things for the climate, the most emissions that you can reduce over a year are a few tons. So the average person in Europe has a carbon footprint of between 4 and 10 tons per year. So even if it was possible to live a completely carbon neutral life, which it currently isn't, the most tons of emissions you could reduce are just the things that you would have produced, so a maximum of a few tons. But, if we really care about the climate and we really want to make a change and we really want to match the scale of the carbon crisis, then we need to go beyond thinking about just our own carbon footprint and thinking about, okay, actually, how can I make the biggest positive impact possible for the climate? And in order to do this, we need to make sure that our individual actions influence larger systems change. And the first way we can do this is to make lifestyle choices that influence the market, like we saw with going plant-based or buying an electric car. The second thing that we can do is take political action. So go to rallies, write to your local MP, vote for people who are going to push forward an ambitious climate agenda. And the third thing is to leverage your influence. So you don't have to be a company CEO in order to have an influence. We all have influence within our friendship groups, our family groups, our place of work. So take some time now and write down on your piece of paper different groups that you have and where you could potentially influence change. And it doesn't have to be huge. It could be just as simple as, influencing the people around you to eat less meat each week. Or it could be the fact that you encourage your company to put in place a climate action plan. We all have influence and we just need to think, how can we leverage it? And the final thing that we can do to influence systems change, and the thing that's often really overlooked, is donating to the most effective climate charities. And we're going to spend the rest of this presentation looking at this. So to illustrate the power of climate donations, let's consider this study by Founders Pledge. So Founders Pledge is a climate research institute, and they did a study a few years ago which looked at the carbon impact of lifestyle choices compared to donations in terms of CO2 emissions avoided. Now, what you can see on the x-axis are different lifestyle choices, and on the y-axis you can see tons of carbon avoided per year for each of these. Now, what's very obvious is if you look on the bar on the far right, and you'll see a $1,000 donation to climate charities. And what you'll notice is that a $1,000 donation is as much as 100 times more effective in terms of carbon emissions reduced than any of these different lifestyle choices. Now, this may sound surprising, but in fact, it sort of makes sense, because if you donate to really effective organisations, then you basically enable people with the power, the influence, the knowledge to make the changes that you would make if you were in their position. And often these changes aren't just influencing one person, like your lifestyle choices are, but they're influencing the whole system within which millions of people exist. And so you can see how donations can actually influence systemic change, which changes the whole market, the whole system, so that everyone's daily activities produce much less emissions. But it's important to note that not all climate charities are effective. And in fact, most climate charities don't reach anywhere near this 100 times effectiveness bar that Founders Pledge spoke about in their report. So how do we find these really high impact donation opportunities? Most of us don't have the time or the knowledge or the expertise, but luckily there are independent climate charity evaluators such as Giving Green that do. Now, Giving Green is an independent charity evaluator, and their team is made up of climate researchers and policymakers, and they spend thousands of hours every year to identify the most effective climate charities. These are the charities that per euro you donate to them have the biggest positive impact on the climate in terms of CO2 emissions reduced. So you're probably thinking, okay, well, how do they do that? There's thousands of climate charities out there. How can they honestly evaluate each and every one? Well, the answer is they don't. What they do is they start off by identifying the most promising strategies for carbon emissions reduction. So a strategy could include up-and-coming climate technology or decarbonising cement production, which is a huge emitter. So they list all of these strategies and they consider which one has the most promise to reduce the most emissions. They look at the scale of this strategy, so how many tonnes of emissions could it feasibly reduce? They look at feasibility, how likely is it that this strategy is going to pay off? And thirdly, they look at funding need. And this is really important because you might have a strategy that's really scalable, reduces loads of emissions. It's definitely going to work in the next couple of years, but governments everywhere are already ploughing money into that strategy, which means that you, as an individual donor, your pound, your euro, your dollar just really isn't going to make much difference. So they're really looking for highly scalable, feasible policy organisations that really need the additional dollars or pounds that you could donate. And when they have a list of their most effective strategies, they make a long list of all of the charities working in each of these strategy areas. And then over time, they narrow this list down to the most effective ones in each strategy area. And every year they produce a list of their top recommendations. So for 2025, these are the impact strategies that Giving Green found to be the most effective in terms of the potential for carbon emissions reduction. And these are the charities that they found to be the most effective in these strategy areas. All of Giving Green's research is completely open source. It's available online, so you can read how they came to their impact strategy decisions, and you can also read their reports on each of these individual charities. Now, we don't have time to talk about all of these charities now, but we will talk about two, the Good Food Institute and Clean Air Task Force. So, one of the strategies for 2025 that Giving Green found to be have really high potential was next generation geothermal energy, also known as super hot rock technology. Now, the reason renewable energy is such an interesting sector is because currently nearly 3/4 of our emissions come from fossil fuels. So if we can replace energy production from fossil fuels with energy production from renewables, then essentially most of our carbon emissions disappear. And when Giving Green was looking at different renewable technology, they identified next generation geothermal as the most promising. And the organisation that's really pushing forward this technology is called Clean Air Task Force. And so this is the reason why they recommend Clean Air Task Force as a really impactful donation opportunity. So let's quickly look at what next generation or super hot rock geothermal power is. So traditional geothermal power, you can only really do that in areas of the world where the rock near the crust of the earth is very hot. So places like Iceland or volcanic regions of the earth. Now, the big advantage of next generation geothermal is due to advancements in drilling, weirdly from the fracking industry, we can now drill way deeper than we used to be able to. And this opens up most areas of the world for geothermal technology. So we can now drill down to areas of the world where the rock is around 400 degrees. So Clean Air Task Force is working on pushing this technology forward to make it come to market, because as soon as this technology is available, it means that we can have geothermal power everywhere. And the other advantage of this next generation geothermal is it's 10 times more effective than traditional geothermal energy. And the third big advantage of this technology is that unlike solar and wind, it's completely consistent form of energy. It's not dependent on conditions, it just constantly produces energy. And it's estimated that this will come to market in the next decade or so, and by 2050, as much as 15% of our energy production could come from super hot rock geothermal. And Clean Air Task Force is currently working on pushing forward the technology for deep drilling and to really bring this technology so that it's available and scalable and that we can use it all over the world. But Clean Air Task Force doesn't just work on technology, it also works on policy lobbying, and they've had some really impressive wins over the last few years. So, for example, in 2024, they were instrumental in pushing forward the EU methane regulation, and that has led to around a third global methane emission reductions from oil and gas. So before this policy, there was no law on how much methane could be produced to produce oil and gas that's imported into the European Union. And that was really bad because the European Union is one of the biggest importers of oil and gas. But now this policy is in place, any imports have to meet the same stringent methane emissions targets as any oil and gas produced within the EU. And this one policy alone is estimated that it will reduce the equivalent emissions of Germany every single year. And you'll see on this list lots of other impressive policy wins over the last 2 decades. But of course, now is not a very favourable time for climate policy. And you may be there sitting there thinking, well, okay, that's all great, but what about now with Trump? What about now with the way that policy is going in the US? Well, one really positive thing is that, for example, geothermal technology has traditionally enjoyed bipartisan support. So we have good evidence and good reason to believe that even under the Trump administration, geothermal energy will still be invested in by the American government, and it's still quite favourable. And another thing to mention about Clean Air Task Force is because they are so embedded in governments enacting to reduce emissions, then they're actually really well placed to absorb the gap that's been left by the US. So, for example, in the last few months, they were working on a project with the US to bring in methane regulations in Kazakhstan, and with the US pulling out of foreign aid, that meant that this deal was about to fall through. But the Clean Air Task Force, through their contacts, have continued with this regulation, and they're now responsible for assisting the government of Kazakhstan with methane emissions reduction targets. So even though the US have stepped down, Clean Air Task Force is stepping up and continuing to lobby for favourable policy environments and continuing to push for these really important technologies that are going to lead to us getting to net zero. And what does, a donation to Clean Air Task Force look like? It's estimated that for every euro you donate to Clean Air Task Force, you can avoid 1 tonne of carbon emissions. And you can find the impact calculations for this on our website if you go to mieux.org, climate change and Clean Air Task Force. And we have lots of details about how this estimation has been calculated. So what does that look like? What does your donation look like in real terms? Let's say, for example, you decided to donate €50 a month to Clean Air Task Force. Well, then you could reduce 600 tonnes of emissions per year. That's the equivalent of planting 7,500 trees and letting them grow for 1 year, and avoiding 95 long-haul flights, and 60 people car-free, and 15 people's average emissions avoided every year. So you can see that just thinking about individual actions alone is very limiting. And what we're absolutely not saying is that we shouldn't plant trees and we shouldn't reduce our flying and we shouldn't reduce how much we drive. We absolutely believe that these lifestyle changes are not only important, but they're vital in order for us to meet our climate targets. However, what we are saying is that donations are a really important and really impactful tool that you as an individual can use to have a huge positive impact on the climate. So it's really worth considering if you have the disposable income. And the second and final strategy we'll look at now is alternative proteins. So alternative proteins are things like tofu and corn that you find in the supermarket today, but there are also things like lab-grown meat and fermented meat that are being developed currently worldwide. And the reason that Giving Green believes alternative proteins are such an effective way to reduce our carbon emissions is because roughly 20% of today's emissions come as a result of meat production. And so if we switched meat with alternative proteins, we could massively reduce these emissions. And the Good Food Institute is the charity that Giving Green believes is the most effective and the most impactful at pushing forward alternative proteins. So the Good Food Institute, they work on novel technology for alternative protein production, and they also lobby governments to create favourable environments for new alternative proteins to come to market. And it's a really important time for alternative proteins because certain countries such as Italy have recently banned lab-grown meat, and many countries with really strong farming lobbies are constantly trying to undermine alternative proteins, whether that's making changes to the packaging, saying you can't call something a vegetarian sausage, has to be called something else, or saying you can't put plant-based milk in the same container as milk. They're basically just trying to make it very difficult for alternative proteins. And so GFI sits within, for example, the European Union and is making sure that these sort of policies can't come in at scale. And in the last couple of years, they've been instrumental in blocking attempts from countries like Italy and Austria from banning lab-grown meat at an EU level. So it's a really important time for this technology, because over the next few years, it's going to almost certainly come into markets and be just as cheap, just as tasty, and just as available as the meat-based alternative. And that's really GFI's goal. And so it's estimated that every €3 you donate to GFI avoids around 1 tonne of carbon, but it's also great news for animals. And it's believed that for every euro you donate to Good Food Institute, you can save the lives of 5 animals from factory farming. And factory farming is a huge problem. 99% of animals worldwide are factory farmed. Around 99% of all animals in the US are factory farmed, and even in France, 80% of animals are factory farmed, and it's a huge cause of animal suffering. And if you're someone who cares about deforestation and biodiversity, well then donating to GFI and promoting alternative protein production could be the best way to reduce deforestation. And that's because today, 41% of deforestation is a direct result of beef production. And what's even worse is most of this beef production is taking place in the tropical rainforest, where our biodiversity is really high. So the promise of alternative proteins then. If just 11% of the protein market was captured by alternative proteins, then we would save the equivalent emissions of almost the entire aviation industry. If everyone switched to alternative proteins, we'd save the equivalent land of India and China combined. And if we did reforestation and carbon sequestration on this freed up land, then we would mitigate around half of global emissions. So this is one technology, one switch to an alternative, and we could halve global emissions. So if you're someone who really aligns with high impact giving and you're impressed with the work of these charities on climate change, if you go to our website, you'll find recommendations not only for the most effective climate charities, but also recommendations for the most effective charities working on global health, animal welfare, and existential risk reduction. And the charities we recommend are just as impactful and just as impressive as the Good Food Institute and Clean Air Task Force. And at Mieux, which means give better in French, we are a guide to charitable donations, which means that our goal is to help donors make the biggest impact they can for their every euro or pound that they donate. We're completely independent and impartial, so we're independently funded. We don't take a cut of any donations through our website. And what this means is 100% of your donation goes directly to the charity of your choice. And it also means we're very impartial in our recommendations. We really have no reason to recommend these charities other than the fact that the best available research shows they're the most effective use of your money as a donor. And as an organisation, we not only encourage donations to really effective charities, but we also encourage people to go even further and make a pledge. So we work with companies to encourage them to pledge for the climate, for example, through the 1% for the Planet Pledge. And, if you're someone with a company, you might want to consider doing a 1% for the Planet Pledge. And if you go on their website, you can sign up. There's hundreds of organisations you can pledge to donate to. Of all of those organisations, these are the 3 recommended by Giving Green, and these are the 3 that we'd recommend you direct your donation to. So we work with different companies to help them implement this pledge on their website. We write marketing materials for them. We embed donation forms. We help them do impact tracking, showing how much they've directed to different charities and how many tons of carbon emissions they've reduced. So, for example, we recently worked with Sidetracked Adventure, who've started doing this. And Sidetracked also encourage their clients to match their donation, which means that not only are they having an impact as a business, they're also leveraging their influence to have even more impact. And it's not only companies that can pledge. We're also part of a global generosity movement of people who decide to pledge between 1% and 10% of their own income to the most effective charities. And the Giving What We Can pledge was started, the 10% pledge by Giving What We Can was started 15 years ago. And so far, nearly 10,000 people from 113 countries have pledged to donate 10% of their income to effective charities. And so giving what we can are our UK partners, but at Mieux, we also promote the 10% pledge. And if 10% sounds like a lot, like too much money to pledge, but you want to make some sort of commitment, if you go on our website and hit pledge, you can also decide to do a trial pledge for between 1 and 10% of your income for as much time as you want. Both myself and my co-founder, Romain, took this pledge a few years ago, and we can honestly say that it's one of the things that we've done that we're most proud of. It really keeps us accountable to our charitable goals, and it just feels really good every month knowing that a part of my income has gone to these really effective charities and it's helping to support their really important work. And I'd like to finish this presentation by saying that all of us here watching this presentation at home have a huge potential to make a really big impact for the climate. We have the knowledge and we have the resources. And if we decided to just change our care and our concern into action and start donating some money to these charities that are really effective or made a pledge for the climate, well, then we could have a huge positive impact and really take a step forward for the climate. If you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch. My email address is there. We offer free donation advice, tax deductibility advice, company support. We can help you write a company pledge for your website. We can help you get forms embedded. We can help you with your marketing material for your climate commitments. And if you've got a friendship group or a company and you want a bespoke presentation, whether in person or online, then we can help you with that too. And before you leave and before you turn off this presentation, I'd really encourage you to just spend 5 minutes writing down 3 things you're going to do following this presentation. So that could be, revisiting the slides, having a look at some of the links to resources mentioned in this presentation, making a lifestyle change, or, hopefully considering donating to one of these really effective charities. And as mentioned again, if you have any questions or you'd like to chat, I'm very happy to talk to you at any time, and I hope you found this presentation useful.